Okay, great. Gonna go ahead and start. So thank you again. So we're here with Thomas Patterson, who is the Harvard Kennedy School Bradlee Professor of Government and the Press, and also a resident faculty member at the Shorenstein Center. So this next hour, Tom is going to present the findings and recommendations from a report which published just last week on January 25th. We're going to save probably about 25 minutes or so at the end for Q&A. So please pop your questions in the Q&A box down below. Thanks so much. Tom, go ahead.
Yeah, Caroline, thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. Our center director, Nancy Gibbs, would also like to be with us today. Some of you know Nancy, former managing editor of Time. She's been an important person behind this study, and but she has a schedule conflict. So, but I want to talk about our study, which we've just released. The preface to it, or the background to it, is the argument that the news crisis is more than simply a crisis for journalism. It's also a community crisis. And what we're finding is that when the news begins to dry up in a community, then the community starts to act less like a community. This has been going on for a long enough period of time now, and we have, sadly, enough communities have been affected that researchers have been able to go into those communities and look at the impact. And by every measure of civic health, those communities are in decline. Social trust, cohesion among the people in the community, understanding, awareness of what's happening locally declined. We've seen increased party polarization in those communities. Now that's happening everywhere, so that may be just a coincidence. But in local elections, we've seen declining voting rates relative to other places, less accountability on the part of local officials. So again, there have been quite a few of these studies. They all point in the same direction. One of the more recent ones is one of the best. It's in book form, Newshole. I recommend it. But in that book, the authors write, in the communities where the cuts to local coverage have declined most sharply, newspapers constitute virtually the only substantive source of news about local government. There's no place else for residents to turn. Our report suggests that there may be another place for people to turn, and that's the local public radio station. And we're seeking through this study to bring local public radio more into the conversation about what we can do to meet communities' information needs in this period of the declining newspaper. Now, they've been part of the discussion. Digital startups are part of that discussion. What we need to do to protect and preserve local newspapers have been part of the conversation. But in that whole mix, local public radio has been a relatively small part of the conversation. This report argues that it should be a larger part. And then the report is designed to provide evidence that might persuade donors the importance of stepping up the funding for local public radio stations. Now, this is where we ended up. This is not where we started. We didn't start with the idea that we're going to write a report that basically puts forth public radio as a significant part of the solution to this community information problem. This is where our data led us. So we started with the question, can local public radio stations help fill the news gap created by the decline of the local newspaper? And to do this study, we did an extensive survey of the NPR member stations. We had a phenomenal response rate, as you can see, nearly 90%. I think our data are representative of the NPR station community. So our survey was somewhat different than most of the surveys that news organizations take. one of the things we needed to do was to assess the environment in which these stations are operating. If we're dealing with a community problem, we need to understand the type of community in which the station operates. We need to have some understanding of the station's current position in that environment, what its capacity is at the moment, the size of its news staff, and then the potential for it to play a larger role in that community. And then what kind of funding would be required to expand that role, and where might that money to come from? That was the logic that we followed in creating our survey questionnaire. So this question of the communities in which local public stations operate, we asked our respondents to think about the adequacy of the news in that environment, news and public affairs content in that environment, excluding their own station, not thinking about themselves, but thinking about the other outlets in the community. This was done on a scale. On one end is what we call rich media, and these are communities that have a pretty robust news system even now. Boston is in that category. New York is in that category. There are communities where there's still a lot of good local news. And then, of course, as you know, on the other end are the news deserts, the places where the newspapers have closed. And as you can see, about 3 out of 5 stations see themselves as being in an area where the community is not being well served by the available news outlets. And then we asked them to position themselves in that environment. Do they think of themselves as the leading outlet or a leading outlet, an important one, but not the leader, or not in that leading category? Now, if you think about this, this is not simply a question of the quality of your news. It's also a question of the size of your audience. You have to be working in both of these areas. You got to have abundant, good quality news to be a leader, and you also have to be reaching a fairly large number of people. So those were 2 different questions. And as you can see, about 1 in 8 of the stations said that they're the leading outlet in terms of the quality and breadth of their coverage. Fewer, only 7% said that they were the leader in terms of audience size. But most stations at least consider themselves to be an important source of local information. But you have to combine these 2 to really think about where they are positioned in their communities. So here you had to be the leading outlet, both in terms of the quality and breadth of your coverage and also in the size of your audience. And when you look at this more restrictive definition of being the leading outlet, you can see that only 1 in 25 stations is in this category. This is, of course, as they define themselves. About half, at least, are a leading important outlet in their community in terms of both what they're delivering to their community, but also how many members of that community are getting their information from that station. Here's the chief obstacle for local stations playing a larger role in their communities. This is staffing. So one of the questions in the survey was about their news staff, the size of the news staff, the number of people who work on news and public affairs. Now that could be in the form of a local talk show. That would be local public affairs. So they would be included in this category. And as you can see, most local public radio stations have very small news staffs, 10 or fewer. We're talking about 3/5 of the local public radio stations. And then when you look at the local news environment, are they operating in a place where there are other news outlets are doing pretty well, or are they operating in a place where the local communities are being underserved in terms of the information available? And you can see this is a bigger problem in those underserved communities. The understaffing issue that faces local public radio is more acute in the communities that are most in need of stronger news outlets. And we used the most generous possible definition you can have of what it means to be on staff. So again, 3/5 have 10 or fewer staff members. But when we asked this question in our survey, here's the reading that we used in terms of how they should count that number. So part-timers, count 1 for 1 with full-timers, any students they might have, interns, regular contributors who are freelancers, then the producers and the like that are supporting those journalists. So these are really understaffed news outlets. And if you think about it and you compare it with even a medium-sized newspaper, that newspaper, even today, will probably have somewhere around 50 people in its newsroom that are creating content, and largely local content. But that capacity is not there for the most part in local public radio stations. And it's a real handicap. One of the things, they call themselves local stations, but if you look at the mix of content that they provide their audiences, they really aren't all that local. So what we did in our survey was to focus on the hours between 6 a.m. Early in the morning to 7 p.m. at night. This is the sweet spot for radio. This is when most of their listeners are there. And we asked them about the content that they provide. And we did that with a number of questions and then aggregated to get up to the amount of coverage that they're doing locally. And you can see that the average across all stations is basically 11 of the hours of those 13 hours are coming from places like NPR, PRI, and those other larger distributors that are providing them content. And only about 2% is local. And in those 2 hours, you have to remember as well, this is not just news about the community. If they repeat it during the day, and local stations do repeat during the day, they count the repeats in this number. If they have an hour-long talk show about local affairs, that gets counted fully in this. So there's not a lot of local there in many ways, even though these are local outlets. But the important point in this, you can see how significant the size of news staff is in terms of their ability to produce this content. And when they're with 10 staff members or fewer, they're only doing half as much local content as if they have 10 or more in the newsroom. So staff size really handicaps them when it comes to covering local. And we see this also in terms of just simply in terms of, they have a reporter assigned to cover local government on an ongoing basis, to really be looking at, what's happening with the city council and the mayor's office and the like, depending on the nature of the governing system in which they're operating. And only 1 out of 4 local stations has a full-time or nearly full-time reporter for local government. And then when you get into those stations that have 10 or fewer, very, very, very few have that. They can't afford the luxury of assigning someone nearly full-time to be doing that job. This also hurts their digital transformation. The audience, the news audience, as you know, is increasingly a digital audience. It's an on-demand audience. There are still some people like me that go after the news at a specific hour. I'm out there every morning at 6 a.m. on my doorstep, picking up my copy of the New York Times and the Boston Globe to read over coffee. I'm an appointee consumer. I do it at an appointed time during the day, but for the most part, we get it digitally. We get it on demand. We get it when we want it. Now, local public radio stations have been transitioning towards digital now for more than a decade, and with significant support from the national level. But you can see here that if you have a small staff, if you don't have very many people in the newsroom, it's really hard to have any kind of presence digital in your community. So if you've got 5 or fewer, and this is just looking at one indicator of that, this is what's on the homepage. If you have 5 or fewer, they don't have very much local news on their webpage. And you can see as you move up, as you have more and more staff, then you can have more and more content of a digital nature that you can offer your audience. And my point here would be, you can't become the go-to audience locally for local news digitally unless you can provide that content in a reasonable abundance and on an ongoing basis. People come into this, take a look, it's the same today as it was yesterday, or there's only an item or two, they're not going to stick around. And that's what the data show about local public radio. They have a digital presence, but they don't have a very loyal audience. And largely, they don't have a loyal audience because their competition is local. They're not going to be able to compete with national outlets. So the national content they provide, if you're going digital, you can find that NY Times, CNN, whatever, wherever you want to go. You're probably not going to your local station. If you're going to go there, you're going to go for what it's offering in terms of local news. But if there's not much there, you're not going to come back regularly, if at all. And here's just another indicator of the handicap of having a small staff. So if you're an organization, news organization that doesn't have very many reporters, wouldn't it be nice if you could do some joint reporting, kind of get some efficiency, working with others, getting twice the number of stories because you're sharing with someone else, another reporter. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you don't have enough staff, you really can't afford to do that. You don't have the luxury of having someone partner with someone from another news organization. And we asked this in the context of 3 possible forms of joint reporting: working with other local public radio stations, regional consortiums of public radio stations, or working with a local news outlet that's not in the public radio system. And as you can see, the smaller the staff, the fewer of these kinds of partnerships that stations are employing, even though they have the greatest need for more reporting resources. So if they're going to be bigger players, if they're going to help fill this gap created by the decline of newspapers, they're going to need new funding. And the question then is, how much money do they need? And what impact would it have if they had it? Later, I'll ask the question, where's it going to come from? But let me focus on these 2 questions first. So we posed the question to the stations: if you wanted to be a significantly bigger player in your community, both in terms of the quality and depth of your coverage, and also in your audience reach, how much of a budget add-on would you need from where you are today? And here are the answers. 13% say they'd need 25% more. Then you, at the upper end, you get 15% they need 3 times or more their current budget. Now, as you could expect, the amount that they ask for percentage-wise is correlated with their current size of the budget. They already have a huge budget, then maybe 25 or 50% more is what they think they need. If they're operating with a tiny budget, then they're going to need a pretty big infusion of cash in order to step up their game in terms of the local community. And we looked at this, and we were able to also ask them for their budget figures. So then we were able to take, okay, here's your budget. You say you need 25% more. That turns out to be this figure. Then we did that across all the member stations. The average was they need about 1.3 million on average more each year to significantly up their game. Now, if you work that across all the member stations of the NPR system, you're talking about roughly $300 million. Now, to put that in perspective, many of you know about Joan Croc's, what she gave to National Public Radio through her estate, and it's about the same amount in terms of inflated dollars as this, but this is every year. So you need a Joan Croc equivalent every year to really boost across the whole spectrum of local public radio. But you reduce that number significantly if you're targeting it for particular stations, and I'll say more about that in a minute. Okay, so the point here that's really significant is that local public radio is an established entity in these communities. It has a brand, and it has a level of trust that's usually higher than most news outlets. It has a digital presence. It has a broadcast presence. And that's the price, basically, of keeping the station on the air. So any new money that would come into the station, a large proportion of that could be pumped into the news budget. So these would be real dollars in terms of boosting the news capacity of these outlets. And you can see that it makes a big difference how big your budget is as to how much you're able to spend on news and public affairs. So if you have a larger budget, you've already paid for kind of keep getting on the air, opening the doors, doing the fundraising things. Every station has to do that. Then it's the leftover money that goes into the budget for news and public affairs. So, and you can see those with small budgets, actually only about 1 out of 5 of their dollars actually is spent in terms of informing the community. In those with bigger budgets, they're spending much more of their money actually on the information function. So then we asked them, okay, now you've got the money, hypothetically, that you asked for. Where does that place you in your community? How does that change your position as a news outlet? The red bar is with that new funding, where they would think they would be in terms of their local community, breadth and quality of their coverage, audience size relative to other news outlets. And you can see 1 out of 3 now think they would be the leading outlet in their community, up from the 4%, if you recall, from that earlier chart. So you can see that they really think that this additional money would really propel them forward in their community and make a difference. And as we saw earlier, looking at how much staffing plays into what they actually can do with this new money, they would have the staffing to do a lot more. It would make a difference in the communities in which they're operating. Now, here's an important chart, that the stations that would benefit the most from new funding are actually in the places where the money or where local information is most needed. These are the stations that generally tend to have the smaller staffs. And if you could staff them out, have them produce more local news. And also, you think about it, they're in places where the competition is weaker. The newspaper is maybe already failed or is really shrunk down in size, but a shell of its former self. They're operating in a less competitive environment. Give them the money and they can be a larger player, really, in helping that community keep in touch with itself. Now, where's the money going to come from? Local sources or outside the communities that we're talking about? So we asked the respondents from these stations, what's the likelihood that you can obtain significant new funding, not just marginal new funding, significant new funding from these local sources? We asked them about others as well, but these were the top 4 in terms of where that actually could make a big difference. Local foundations, local private gifts, local corporate underwriting, membership contributions that local stations depend on. And you can see they're pretty optimistic about receiving significant new funding from the community. But what's interesting in this, if you look at the column on the far right, they're less optimistic in those communities that are most in need. The communities where the information deficit is the greatest. The stations there are less convinced that local sources are going to provide the funding they need to inform that community. Now, why is that? Why are these stations facing more of a problem in terms of raising local funding? Well, many of them are in hard places for local public radio to thrive. So what I've done in that first part of this graph is the income level of the area in which the station is operating. And you can see that stations that are in those weaker news environments where the information is really weakened or been weak all along, they're more likely to be areas where the residents are below average income. That makes it harder. They depend very heavily on member contributions, but they're talking to a community that's less affluent. That inhibits their ability to raise the money at the local level. And then on the second part of this chart, you can see that they're disproportionately in Republican areas. And what we've seen over the last 20 years with the rise of Fox and the increasing popularity of right-wing talk radio and the like is that a good chunk of Republicans who formerly paid attention to local public radio have moved away from it to these other outlets. So that audience has fewer and fewer Republicans in it. And of course, the more Republicans you have in the area you serve, it's going to be harder to attract a significant share of that public to your station. And of course, that inhibits your ability to raise funding locally. I also think that the local stations probably exaggerate what they can do locally. Let me talk about that just for a second here in terms of member contributions. So again, this is for most stations, this is the most important source of their revenue. When they ask the people who listen or are online, contribute to your local public radio station. About 40% of the money in public radio comes from the listener contributions. But if you look at that over time, that line's been pretty flat. About the same percentage of listeners contribute as did 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So why all of a sudden is that going to be a significant source of new funding? If that money's been out there, given all that they do to try to attract listener contributions, I have a hard time believing that it's suddenly going to just materialize overnight. So I think they overestimate their ability to raise the funds at the local level. Yet they have a pitch now. They have an argument to be made that was harder to make before. Again, to go back to that point I made at the beginning, when local news begins to dry up, a community stops acting like a community. Its civic health across the board begins to diminish. If you want to protect these communities, you want to keep them as thriving civic entities, you really have to do something at the local level to strengthen local news so that people have the common bond that comes with understanding what's going on in their communities. They can make that pitch. So it's possible that more funding can occur through the local level than has been true in the past. But I think realistically, we're going to have to look outside communities if we're going to bolster local public radio stations. So as many of you know, our governments are not very generous when it comes to public broadcasting. Per capita, we spend less than $3 through all of our governments, $3 a year. Now, if you look at Great Britain, you're well above $50 a year. That's true in many Western European countries. They publicly fund public broadcasting at a much higher level. So I think governments need to step up, need to understand what this information deficit in these communities is doing to our democratic health. And state governments, some state governments do contribute. Now, it may be of interest to you that the 3 states that give the most to public radio are red states, Republican-controlled states. And now, they tend to serve rural communities, and they understand the importance of public radio to rural communities in terms of keeping them abreast of what's going on with market prices, going on with the weather. These are critical pieces of information in rural communities, and local public radio stations in these areas do a good job of providing it. So they understand the need to keep it, but that argument can be made and made more strongly. National foundations. Now, what the national foundations have been doing, they understand this problem. They understand, they're well aware what's happening in our communities with that drying up of the local newspapers and the information deficit and all of the adverse consequences that attend that. So I think their attention to this problem has never been higher. But if you look at how they're allocating their funding, not much of it is going toward local public radio. So I think being alerted to the potential of local public radio could make them a larger source of this funding. But my own feeling is that this is going to have to come primarily from new major private donors, people of wealth who haven't previously contributed to public broadcasting in this country. And the money is there. As you know, income inequality is at the highest level since the 1920s, the roaring 20s. And if you look at that's most of that income inequality is in the hands of new families, not old families. This is in the hands of people who've become very wealthy on developments of the last 3 or 4 decades. The digital revolution, that same revolution that's really, put newspapers on the downward slope, has been a source of wealth for many people. And interestingly, many of those people have made great wealth through the changes. Have turned out to be some of their wealth, much of their wealth, to really move certain things along. Climate change being an example. A lot of money being spent on ameliorating diseases and the like. Public radio has been low on their priority list. But if they can be informed, alerted to why it's so important for communities to have information about the community, why that's so important to their civic health. It's as important as the level of education. It's important as anything that you can think about in the community that keeps a community healthy in terms of its civic life. If they can be convinced of that, I think there'll be a significant source of new funding, particularly since in many cases, the money they have made has been on the back of the old media. So then you think about allocating the new funding. Communities that have a greater need seem to me to be those that should be at the top of the list. But then when you look at those stations, and we have a lot of data from our survey, some stations, even in the areas that I'm talking about, where the information need is the greatest, are really not very well positioned, even if they had money to really serve their community in a more substantial way. So I think it has to be very targeted in that sense. And then there are stations that are in areas that are doing reasonably well now, that are so well positioned, and in some ways have gained such a status in their communities that we need to bolster them. So I think it works both in terms of need, but also in terms of what that station's particular positioning, capacity, track record has been, and the like, in terms of these allocation decisions. We don't do fundraising here. Harvard rules don't permit it. We don't set allocation rules. Even if we were able to fundraise, we wouldn't be able to figure out how to divide it up. But these are guidelines. That's what the report does. This report is intended to raise awareness about the problem we have, the possibility of local public radio being a significant player in this area, where the money might come from, and then how to think about really using that money in the most effective way. So thank you. And again, thank you very much for being here. I probably talked longer than I intended to, but I've become actually, when you start these studies, you're not involved, right? And then you as you go along and you get your findings, and all of a sudden they point in one direction, somehow you become a passionate advocate for what you have found. And I guess I'm in that category.
Thanks, Tom. So we're going to begin the Q&A portion. So the first question is going to be from Mark. And so it's two parts. So first he asked, let's see, you quote someone as observing that local public radio punches above its weight, and you view this as a strong argument, but it seems that most local media are now multi-platform. Why do you think that local public radio is a better place to invest than a digital news service?
I don't make that argument, actually, Mark. I think this one has to be all hands on deck. And in some localities, I think the better investment from the question of the civic health of a community is a digital startup. Other places, I think it's the local public radio station, and there are other models too. But my point would be about local public radio. It's already a digital platform. It doesn't have to go through that startup process, and it already has a brand. It's already a known commodity in the community. What we're seeing is that, and there are other studies, not this particular study, but actually in most of the communities where the newspaper has folded, there is not a viable digital alternative. So there are lots of places, I think, where digital startups are exactly or if you have to only do one, you do that one. But I'm not even arguing for that. I think we have to have kind of this idea. We're out of the newspaper era. During the golden age of the newspaper, if you were the newspaper in town, you were by far, you had the best coverage, the broadest coverage. You also had by far the biggest audience. You had both the things that going for you. The newspaper, 100% of communities, the big player was the newspaper. It was serving both of those functions. We're now in a period of fragmented media markets. We'll never have one news outlet that's going to dominate a community in the way that the local newspapers did during their heyday. So to me, the question of meeting communities' information needs is doing it through multiple channels, because that's also the way people operate today. But the mix in any given point, from if you're stepping back and saying, what's the best mix in this community or that community? In some places, it's trying to keep that newspaper, keep the doors open. Sometimes the biggest effort maybe should be around local public radio. Some places, a digital startup. Again, I made the point about some local public radio stations. I won't go into the details here. I don't want to put any of them on the spot, but some of them really don't operate in a way that would allow them to do this very effectively. So you wouldn't want to make a huge investment in a station of that kind. Others, in fact, do see a public mission and really do want to expand into the space in a significant way, and have a deep commitment to doing so, and a deep commitment to their community in the process. That, to me, is a pretty good target for new funding.
So then the second part of his question, he referenced the graphs on page 29 that they show that local news gets a much lower percentage of attention when staffs are smaller. And then on page 30, you noted that lower income markets are more likely to be news deserts and have a greater need for funding. But then won't those markets have smaller staffs and thus produce less local news?
Yeah, and it's a trap. It's kind of a downward spiral, right? So that and that's what I said. I mean, some of the stations are in places where, yeah, you could beef up the staff, but probably if you think about that in comparison with a station in a somewhat different location, those same resources would go farther in the second location. Some of these stations really are in areas, have very small audiences. I won't go into it here, but we do have some data in the paper about audience size and membership size, and the amount that they get digital versus over the air and the like. So that's a more micro level look at. But the important point when you look at the data is just the wide variation in these stations. Even though they're part of the same network, they are greatly different in terms of the size of their audience, the potential size of their audience on every one of these indicators. There's a lot of variation. All of those things, I think, come into play when you think about, okay, targeting, which ones are the real candidates, where you can fill a need. We're never going to have enough money to be back where the newspapers were. I'll just give you the figure about, if you go back 20 years, newspapers pulled in $50 billion a year through their advertising, their circulation, their other sources of revenue. That's now under $10 billion. You think about that significant fall off in revenue. That tells you the story of why they're not thriving, why so many are closed or just hollow shells of their former self. So, I don't think we're talking that kind of money. I don't think we're talking having those kinds of resources in these communities. So the question is, we got to be smart about how we allocate the funding that is available, and really use it in ways to just do as good a job as we can. It's not going to be perfect, but I think it's going to take a lot of thinking. I would like to see us do a similar study of this about local television. It actually has a bigger audience than local public radio. As you know, many of the stations really emphasize sensationalism, crime and fires and the like. And it's a certain kind of information about the community, but is there a greater possibility that they could be more public interest outlets than many of them are? And of course, that would be a great help. So, they also can be part of the solution to this problem.
Next question is, you note in the paper that only 12% of respondents reported frequent collaboration with other types of news outlets. What could be done to encourage more collaboration among various types of outlets? And what can funders do to support these collaborations? Assuming that figuring out how to pay journalists is one of the barriers to collaboration.
Yeah. So, if you look, for example, at NPR, NPR has put a real emphasis on this, and so you have these regional consortiums that they've helped encourage, and the larger stations in those regions have usually been kind of the leaders in putting these things together, and have been able to pull some of the stations with fewer resources into those consortium. I do think kind of the sponsorship thing does matter. I think when you think at the local level and a public radio station, sort of working with a commercial outlet, that is not to me, a road too far, but it's not a road that's normally traveled. So you've got to begin to start thinking about, okay, what are the prospects here? So my local newspaper is really much smaller than it used to be. What are its strengths and weaknesses? What are our strengths and weaknesses? Where's there some synergy? Where are there comparative advantages to both of us in terms of doing some forms of collaboration? And you have to think about it in those terms. You really, when you don't have many resources, you've got to think about comparative advantages. Both parties have to be able to get something from the collaboration. And when you have this really small local public radio station, doesn't have a very big staff, it hasn't been a very big player locally, it goes to the traditionally big player in town and says, would you like to collaborate? You kind of end up backing in the door to make that request. So I think to be able to think about these things, to encourage these things, getting people to understand this is a multiplier, but it takes a certain level of staffing to be able to play the game. And that was the point that I was trying to make earlier. If you're really just struggling to do the basics, then to add these things on that really add important, and I'm not diminishing the importance of what you do with joint reporting. I'm just saying that if you barely have enough to do the basics, and usually not even enough to do that, then it's really hard to think about doing these other things.
The next question is from Seth. So he is asking, what do you make of the argument that funders should prioritize news startups over NPR investment because NPR's brand limits it to an older, wider, more liberal audience?
I think that's a really good question. And, maybe it wouldn't surprise you, but many of our respondents made the same complaint, but they see that as a problem of the national programming, the national programming is too directed toward what has been their traditional donor audience, kind of middle class and a little bit above that, and largely white, and increasingly with our partisan divisions and the many Republicans moving to the other kind of media system, that we now have two media systems in this country, that kind of encourages you to kind of cater a little bit more to the left than you might have under other conditions. The surprising number of stations are aware of that and think it's a problem at their level, and they're not thinking that way locally. So, and when they think locally, they think about, okay, what's the nature of my community? How do I best serve it? How do I bring the various voices that are here into the conversation? So now, it doesn't mean that all of them are thinking in that way, but we had a surprising number of the stations saying, we got a problem here because our potential audience is more conservative than the audience that is, for the most part, is being served by the national feeds that we're getting. And we've got to think more broadly, and we'd like them to think a little bit more broadly about audience. So I think your point is a very valid one. I'm not, that's what I've said does not diminish the significance of it, because, but if you, again, though, if you begin to think that we're never going back to that day where one news outlet can meet a community's information needs, that it's going to take multiple outlets and communities. And there's a piece for digital, there can be a piece for local public radio, there can be a piece for local television, there can be a piece left for what's left of our newspapers. But we'd like all of them to do well, to do better than they're doing now. So again, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's, again, and then in a particular community, what mix, who's stronger, who's weaker here, who can really make the bigger difference for the same amount. So I'm not trying to again push local public radio as against the alternatives. I'm just saying it needs to be a larger part of the conversation than it's been. I think that's what our study says.
So Richard asked, what role, if any, do you see for student reporters? Do you see any possible collaboration with public radio stations there?
Oh, I think there's extraordinary possibilities there. One thing about students, if they're not free, they're close to free, because oftentimes they're on work study, and what you're paying them is subsidized. So in most cases, you're working with student journalists in the sense that they're part of a journalism program. This is where they want their career to be. So they take seriously the learning opportunity that comes with working at a local public radio station. So I think those kinds of collaborations are quite valuable. I'd like to see more stations in areas where they don't have that adjacent journalism program to think about what else the nearby college or university might be able to offer them in terms of student interns. And that doesn't mean that they're on the air, but they can be in terms of doing research. They're usually digitally more adept than some of the people that have been in that newsroom for 30 or 40 years, maybe they can be a real significant contributor to the digital component. And again, the key to getting people to access you digitally is you got to keep putting new content up. You got to keep putting up relevant content. And these local stations or local startups, if they're digital, they're never going to compete in terms of being in terms of the national news they carry. I'm not going to go to those stations to get my national news. I'm going to go to one of these national players that's got hundreds of reporters and it's got great depth. So your competition is local. So the more content that you can put up, the better the content, the better position you're going to be in your local community. And if student interns can really make that work on the digital side, particularly, open the door, bring them in. They've got ideas, they got things they care about, and it'll be a great benefit to them too, also, to go out into the community and sit through a city council meeting and learn, what this is actually like in the real world. And so I think it works both ways. I think it's great for their education. I think it can be great for the local station. Interesting, I want to make one point. There are some university-based stations, I won't name them, but that we identified in our study that basically have very little relationship with the university. The university is the licensee, but they've kind of worked their way away from it because their costs too. I mean, if you're, there's a lot of turnover with students. You've got an education process there that takes staff time. So you got to be really committed to this.
So Nancy, so she asked, her local public radio station is often overly cautious about covering public affairs and doing aggressive watchdog journalism. So she believes that it's not an issue of staff size, but possibly will. So what to do in that situation?
Well, I mean, if you think about investigative reporting, investigative reporting is probably one of the least efficient forms of reporting that there is. It takes a huge amount of time and can extend over a long period of time, not only hours at doing it, but can extend over a period of time. If you don't have much staff, can you really afford to have someone really working on a story for 2 months or 3 months, and then, maybe at the end of the day, not having something to report because they couldn't get everything nailed down, or if they do, having a really important story, but it's a 1 or 2 day story for the station, but they've lost 20% of their reporting capacity in the process. I mean, this is a real dilemma. I think the places where they do play some role in investigative reporting in the community is when you get these stations that have staffs that are significantly more than what most public radio stations have. I think it's a burden that's almost a little too far for them. Now, once in a while, one of these things will drop in their lap. Once in a while, you feel like you got lucky that a reporter gets a tip or gets a document or something like that, and the story just falls there and it's all there, and you can really push it out a little bit, and it's a real blockbuster and all of that. But most investigative reporting is hard digging over a period of time to really nail down the story, and it's a luxury that is very difficult. And we see it in newspapers. I mean, much less talk about local public radio not being able to do this. One of the first things to go in local newspapers is they trim staff size is their investigative reporting teams, because increasingly they just have hardly enough staff to meet the daily flow needs for the daily flow, much less trying to do something that's going to be a real hit 6 months from now, something like that.
So let's see here. So Ron was curious, did any of your respondents indicate how they are or are planning to increase their fundraising capability?
Yeah, we do have, that was one of the questions that we did ask. It was open-ended, not forced choice. There were some ideas that some of them had. We'll clean up the data, and this data set, we'll make available to the community. We don't have any reason to kind of sequester it, hold it, lock it in a closet. Others, there'll be researchers who might want to cut into this and may in fact reach some conclusions different from what we do. I mean, but that, I think making the data available is an important part of the research process. And there were things that we weren't all that interested in, but we had to ask questions to kind of get tangentially to what we were really interested in there, that, journalism educators may be interested in doing some research by looking at some of that data, things that interest them, and then lead to publication in articles on journalism education and the like, or radio and television, that sort of thing. So there's data there. We're going to make it available. But that data that you're asking me about, that came through. We had 3 open-ended questions that really allowed them to say some things about, did they have some ideas? What did they find that's working, that's really kind of working really well? What did we miss in terms of the questions that we asked? So, and there's some really rich responses there that, we didn't mine them, but someone should be mining the richness of those and the really extraordinary observations and recommendations that are in those comments.
And so Tim wants to know, do you know if there are any national media organizations that recognize the role public radio could play in local news that are trying to lead efforts to find funding to improve local reporting?
So, I mean, there's the ongoing efforts, of course, by the major players. They're involved in fundraising on an ongoing basis. Oftentimes that's working with through the foundations with private donors and so on. I don't know what form this would take. As I said, we're not allowed to be the fundraiser. One of the things that came out in the survey from some of our respondents in those open-ended is they said, don't let NPR do it. Now, I thought that was really kind of interesting. They're part of the system, but what they meant by that was, they worry. I mean, in any system, you're part of the system. You're kind of one of the weaker links in it. I don't mean weaker in the sense of you care less or anything like that, but you're not a big news station. You don't have a big staff and the like, and you always worry in that situation that you kind of lose out when resources are being allocated. You don't quite get what you think is your appropriate share. And actually, if you look at many of the policies that NPR has pursued over the year, that had a certain logic to them. I think they made extraordinary sense. They invested more heavily in their really top stations. And the reason they did that was, but they thought they will develop things that then can be worked down to stations that have fewer resources, right? So that that's where the innovations are going to come, and then they'll benefit everybody in the system. So that was the justification for that tendency to kind of push money toward those that already had more of it. But I think the logic of this report, and the logic certainly of thinking about the communities that have information deficits, is to push the money down. And I think some of the stations that are on that end where they really need it and they know their community needs the information, I think they worry that if this kind of fundraising effort was carried out through one of these existing organizations, they might well end up with the short stick. So, perhaps it would be best if they're an independent entity that had good representation across the public radio spectrum, really took the lead. But again, that's kind of, you're getting out of my lane here. This is this is not really what I do. I mean, I think, for example, if we go back to that wonderful renovation of the Great Hall at Ellis Island, and where did the leadership on that come from? It didn't come from the National Park Service, even though Ellis Island is part of the National Park Service. The leader on that was Lee Iacocca, who had been at Ford, was the brainstorm behind the Mustang in the 1960s, and then it went and headed Chrysler, very prominent business leader, took the lead, and what he was able to do was to get other people in business, other people who had the means to join in. And my sense is probably that somewhere like something like that probably is what's needed. Now, whether something like that will materialize in a month's time, roughly, we're going to try to pull together some people in this space. Some of them are organizationally based, foundation people. Some of them will be in that kind of private donor community, to try to see if we can't kind of be an incubator of at least stimulating some people who can make a difference in this space, committing to making a difference. But that's the most that we can do on our end to push this along, besides putting out this report and trying to get buzz going about, let's think about local public radio, and maybe they can really help us in this space. And again, not just local public radio, but a part of it, part of the answer to this growing civic problem we have in this country at the local level.
Great. So I recognize that we are at 1 o'clock. So that'll be the last question, but thank you again for joining. And as I mentioned, a recording of this webinar will be up on our website in just a few days.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your willingness to spend an hour. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.